Across the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg, the grand halls of Vienna, and the iron fortresses of Berlin, the fate of empires once rested in the hands of royal families whose names still echo through history. The Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs. These were not just rulers, but symbols of power, tradition, and sometimes terrifying collapse. Their reigns shaped the map of Europe, dictated the outcomes of wars, and steered the course of millions of lives through centuries of glory and grief. But how did such seemingly unshakable dynasties fall so swiftly? And what legacy did they leave behind in the ruins of their shattered thrones? Welcome to Words of Time, your gateway into the stories that shaped our world. In this video, we'll journey through the rise and fall of Europe's most powerful royal houses, uncovering how the tsars, kaisers, and kings built empires, waged wars, and ultimately lost their crowns. Let's explore the drama, ambition, betrayal, and legacy of the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, and their imperial peers in Eastern and Northern Europe. Europe's history is steeped in the drama of monarchs and the sprawling legacies they left behind. Nowhere is this more evident than in Eastern and Northern Europe, where great dynasties such as the Romanovs of Russia, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia and Germany, and the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary once ruled vast and diverse populations. These royal families were not merely ceremonial figureheads. They were military commanders, political architects, and cultural patrons who shaped the course of European and global history. They forged empires from war and diplomacy, built capitals that dazzled the world, and embodied the grandeur and contradictions of monarchy in the modern age. For centuries, these rulers have held together empires that spanned diverse languages, religions, and ethnic identities. They negotiated the challenges of modernization, nationalism, and industrialization, often clinging to divine right and bloodline in an age that increasingly questioned such authority. Their courts were centers of opulence and intrigue, their decisions capable of changing the fate of millions. Yet, despite their might, these dynasties were not immune to collapse. World wars, revolutions, and internal decay would eventually bring them to ruin, ending centuries of royal rule in a matter of years. This video traces the rise, dominance, and eventual fall of the great dynasties of Eastern and Northern Europe. We begin with the Romanovs, who transformed Russia into an empire and faced its ultimate reckoning during the Bolshevik Revolution. We then turn to the Hohenzollerns, whose ambition unified Germany, but whose militarism helped spark global conflict. Alongside them, we explore other royal houses, such as the Habsburgs, whose story is deeply interwoven with the fate of Central Europe. Through wars, alliances, reforms, and revolutions, we examine how these dynasties have built legacies that continue to shape our understanding of power and identity today. The rise of dynasties, bloodlines, crowns, and the birth of empire. The foundations of royal power in Eastern and Northern Europe were laid not in a single moment, but over generations of conquest, marriage, and political maneuvering. Dynasties such as the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, and Habsburgs rose to prominence by asserting both military strength and divine right. In Russia, the time of troubles, a period of political chaos and foreign invasion in the early 17th century, gave rise to the Romanov dynasty. In 1613, 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar by a national assembly, marking the beginning of a dynasty that would rule Russia for over 3 centuries. The Romanovs claimed legitimacy through blood ties to the old Rurikid line and through their close association with the Russian Orthodox Church, which anointed their authority as sacred. In Prussia, the Hohenzollerns were originally a family of minor Swabian nobles, but through centuries of strategic marriages and military prowess, they carved out a growing territory in Brandenburg and eventually assumed the royal title of king in Prussia in 1701. Their rise was marked by a fierce commitment to centralization, a disciplined military, and a bureaucracy that rivaled any in Europe. Under Frederick the Great in the 18th century, Prussia emerged as a formidable power, proving that a relatively small kingdom could rival great empires through effective leadership and martial efficiency. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, the Habsburgs had already established themselves as one of the most enduring and complex dynastic powers in history. Though their roots were in Austria, their reach extended far beyond, into Hungary, Bohemia, Spain, and even the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Habsburgs built their empire through calculated marriages more often than through war, famously adopting the strategy, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." By the 18th century, they presided over a multi-ethnic empire where dozens of languages were spoken and multiple faiths coexisted under a deeply Catholic court. These dynasties built their legitimacy not only through bloodlines and military strength, but through the symbols and rituals of monarchy. Coronations were lavish public performances of divine right. Royal portraits and architecture projected the permanence of their power. Courts became centers of culture and politics where noble families vied for influence, and emperors were both sovereigns and stage managers of public perception. For centuries, the monarch was more than a ruler. They were the embodiment of the nation, the state, and often the will of God. Yet beneath the splendor lay the seeds of future crisis. The reliance on hereditary succession sometimes led to weak or incompetent rulers. Expanding empires brought in populations with diverging interests, loyalties, and identities. New ideas about liberty, representation, and national identity began to challenge the foundations upon which these dynasties rested. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the monarchies of Eastern and Northern Europe stood powerful, but increasingly vulnerable, facing a world that was changing faster than their traditions could adapt. The Hohenzollerns, from Prussia to the Kaiserreich. The story of the Hohenzollern dynasty is one of steady ascent from minor nobility to imperial rulers. Their origins lay in the hilly region of Swabia in southwestern Germany, where the family held a modest title as Counts of Zollern in the 11th century. For generations, the Hohenzollerns were local power holders, lacking the prestige of Europe's great houses. Their fortunes changed dramatically in 1415 when Frederick VI of Nuremberg, a loyal ally of Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, was granted the title of Elector of Brandenburg. This elevation transformed the family's status overnight. As electors, the Hohenzollerns gained significant political influence, including the right to participate in choosing the Holy Roman Emperor. Though Brandenburg was at the time a relatively undeveloped and peripheral territory, it gave the family a foothold in the northern German world, from which they would launch. The real foundation of Hohenzollern power, however, was laid in 1618, when the family inherited the Duchy of Prussia. Though geographically separate from Brandenburg and technically outside the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia became part of a personal union under the Hohenzollern crown. Thus, Brandenburg-Prussia was born, a patchwork of territories whose future strength would depend on administrative centralization and military efficiency. The man responsible for this transformation was Frederick William, who came to be known as the Great Elector. He ruled from 1640 to 1688, a period shaped by the devastating consequences of the 30 Years' War. In response to the destruction and disunity of his lands, Frederick William reformed the army, restructured the tax system, and invited persecuted religious minorities, such as the French Huguenots, to settle in his realm, bringing with them skills and capital. His policies laid the groundwork for the creation of a bureaucratic state that would eventually become the engine of Prussian, and later German, power. Following his reign, his son Frederick III sought greater recognition for the dynasty. In 1701, he crowned himself king in Prussia as Frederick I, with the approval of the Holy Roman Emperor. The phrasing, in Prussia, was carefully chosen to avoid constitutional conflicts within the empire, but the symbolism was clear. The Hohenzollerns now belonged to the ranks of Europe's royalty. Frederick I's reign was marked by lavish court expenditures, but his son and successor, Frederick William I, reversed that pattern. Known as the Soldier King, Frederick William I ruled with frugality and rigidity. He expanded the military dramatically, turning the Prussian army into one of the most formidable in Europe relative to the state's size. He also tightened control over the nobility and bureaucracy, promoting a culture of obedience and discipline that would become synonymous with Prussian governance. The zenith of Prussian absolutism and military prowess came under Frederick II, more commonly known as Frederick the Great. Ascending the throne in 1740, Frederick was both an Enlightenment monarch and a ruthless strategist. He championed religious tolerance, invested in education, reformed the legal code, and corresponded with major intellectuals such as Voltaire. Yet his domestic reforms were overshadowed by his military campaigns. Through the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, he managed to seize and hold the rich territory of Silesia from Austria, vastly expanding Prussian influence. Under Frederick's leadership, Prussia became a great European power, commanding respect and fear on the continent. Still, despite his Enlightenment rhetoric, he remained an autocrat who had little interest in constitutional governance or democratic reform. In the 19th century, the Hohenzollerns faced a world in transformation. The defeat of Prussia by Napoleon in 1806 and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire marked a humiliating moment. But after the fall of Napoleon, Prussia emerged from the ashes of war reinvigorated. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, it gained significant new territories, particularly in the Rhineland, and re-established itself as a leading German state. Yet it also became increasingly clear that the central question of the century would be German unification. Throughout the early decades of the 19th century, the Hohenzollerns struggled with liberalism and nationalism. While economic modernization took root, through railways, industrial growth, and legal reforms, the monarchy remained suspicious of democratic demands. During the Revolutionary Year of 1848, King Frederick William IV famously rejected the liberal offer of a German imperial crown from the Frankfurt Parliament, calling it a crown from the gutter. Real change began with the accession of Wilhelm I in 1861, a monarch who would prove crucial not for his leadership, but for his appointment of Otto von Bismarck as minister-president of Prussia. Bismarck, a master of political strategy and power politics, pursued the unification of Germany not through parliaments and speeches, but through calculated warfare and diplomacy. In a series of swift military campaigns, against Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1870, Bismarck dismantled old alliances and built new ones. He aimed to forge a German empire under Prussian leadership, and to do so in a way that excluded Austria from the equation. The climactic moment came in 1871, when Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor, Kaiser, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The symbolic choice of location, within the palace of France's fallen monarchy, underscored the dramatic shift in European power. Germany was now united under the Prussian crown, and the Hohenzollerns had reached the apex of their influence. The German Empire, or Kaiserreich, was federal in structure, but its real power rested with the emperor and his chancellor. Bismarck, as chancellor, implemented a pragmatic and conservative domestic policy. He suppressed socialist movements while simultaneously introducing social insurance systems to undercut their appeal. He also sought to preserve the European balance of power through a complex web of alliances designed to isolate France and prevent a two-front war. However, the system Bismarck built relied heavily on his genius and political control. When Wilhelm I died in 1888, his son Frederick III briefly ruled, but succumbed to cancer after just 99 days. He was succeeded by Wilhelm II, a brash and impulsive young man who clashed with Bismarck and forced his resignation in 1890. Under Wilhelm II, Germany took a sharp turn toward aggressive nationalism and imperialism. The new Kaiser was determined to rule personally and to make Germany a global power. He embarked on a naval arms race with Britain, sought overseas colonies, and abandoned Bismarck's cautious diplomacy in favor of a policy known as Weltpolitik. These decisions strained Germany's relationships with other powers, contributing to the formation of rival alliances and deepening international tensions. Though Wilhelm's court was obsessed with military spectacle and grandeur, his actual strategic vision was flawed and inconsistent. His unpredictable behavior, combined with rising militarism and nationalism at home, made Germany an increasingly destabilizing force in Europe. By 1914, the Hohenzollerns stood atop a vast and powerful empire, but one that was dangerously brittle. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria set off a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations, Germany's support for Austria-Hungary helped ignite World War I. The German army quickly found itself embroiled in a two-front war that dragged on for years. As the war ground into a stalemate, domestic unrest grew. Starvation, inflation, and industrial strikes sapped the morale of the population. Revolution loomed. In November 1918, with Germany facing military collapse and revolution sweeping the cities, Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. He fled into exile in the Netherlands, marking the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's 5-century reign. The German Empire was no more. In its place arose the Weimar Republic, a fragile democratic experiment born amid the ruins of war. The legacy of the Hohenzollerns is as grand as it is tragic. They transformed a backwater frontier into one of the most disciplined and advanced states in Europe. They engineered the unification of Germany and built a powerful industrial and military complex. But they also cultivated authoritarianism, mistrusted democracy, and ultimately contributed to the conditions that sparked global conflict. The dynasty's fall was not simply a matter of defeat in war. It was the collapse of a system that had failed to adapt to the demands of the modern age. The Habsburgs, empire without a nation. The story of the Habsburgs is the story of Europe's most enduring and complex monarchy. While the Hohenzollerns rose with war and iron, the Habsburgs expanded through marriage, diplomacy, and dynastic inheritance. Their motto, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry," captured the essence of a strategy that gave the family dominion over much of Central and Eastern Europe without the need for conquest, at least at first. The dynasty's rise began in 1273 when Rudolf I of Habsburg was elected king of the Romans, breaking the dominance of the rival Hohenstaufen family in the Holy Roman Empire. Although Rudolf did not become emperor in name, his reign marked the beginning of Habsburg prominence. A few decades later, the family secured control over Austria, which would become the heart of their dominions. From this core, the Habsburgs steadily expanded their influence through strategic marriages with powerful royal houses in Bohemia, Hungary, Spain, Burgundy, and the Low Countries. The marriage of Maximilian I to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 brought vast territories in the Netherlands and parts of France under Habsburg control. Later, the union of his son Philip the Handsome with Joanna of Castile produced Charles V, whose reign would stretch across Europe and into the Americas. Charles V inherited a global empire, becoming Holy Roman Emperor in 1519 and ruling lands from Spain to the Netherlands, Austria to Naples, and large swaths of the New World. His empire was so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. But such a size brought logistical and political problems. Faced with the Reformation, constant wars with France and the Ottoman Empire, and internal administrative strain, Charles eventually divided his empire. In 1556, he abdicated, leaving the Spanish Empire to his son Philip II and the Austrian and imperial territories to his brother Ferdinand I. This split created two lines of the Habsburg family, the Spanish and the Austrian. While the Spanish Habsburgs would die out in 1700, the Austrian line continued to dominate Central Europe for centuries. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the Austrian Habsburgs remained central to the politics of the Holy Roman Empire. They held the imperial title almost continuously and fought to preserve Catholicism and dynastic order amid the chaos of religious wars and shifting alliances. The 30 Years' War devastated much of Germany, but it reinforced the Habsburgs' role as protectors of Catholic Europe. Despite internal challenges and external threats, especially from the expanding Ottoman Empire, the dynasty managed to survive, adapt, and reassert its authority. In 1740, the death of Emperor Charles VI and the succession of his daughter Maria Theresa triggered the War of the Austrian Succession. Although Maria Theresa faced initial resistance due to her gender, she proved to be a capable and determined ruler. Her administrative reforms, emphasis on education, and efforts to centralize control over the empire laid a foundation for modern governance. Her son, Joseph II, was one of the most ambitious reformers of the Enlightenment era. He attempted to modernize the empire by promoting religious tolerance, abolishing serfdom, and streamlining administration. However, his top-down reforms often provoked backlash from entrenched interests, and many of his policies were reversed after his death. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars forced the Habsburgs into a new phase of their history. The old Holy Roman Empire, fragmented and outdated, finally came to an end in 1806 when Emperor Francis II, under pressure from Napoleon, dissolved it and declared himself Emperor of Austria instead. The Austrian Empire became a more centralized political entity, though it remained deeply diverse in its population. German-speaking Austrians ruled over a realm that included Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Poles, Ukrainians, Italians, Romanians, and Jews. Managing such a heterogeneous empire was a constant struggle, as rising nationalist movements across Europe in the 19th century increasingly challenged the legitimacy of dynastic monarchy. The revolutions of 1848 marked a turning point. As uprisings erupted across the continent, the Habsburg Empire faced internal collapse. In Vienna, liberals and workers demanded a constitution, while in Hungary, nationalists sought independence. The imperial government was momentarily paralyzed, and Emperor Ferdinand I abdicated in favor of his young nephew, Franz Joseph. Though only 18 years old, Franz Joseph would reign for nearly 70 years and become the symbol of a fading imperial order. He responded to the 1848 revolutions with repression, but also understood the necessity of limited reform. Following military defeats in the 1850 and 1860, particularly against France and Sardinia in Italy, and against Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the empire lost much of its prestige. The defeat by Prussia ended Austria's leadership of the German-speaking world and pushed the Habsburgs to reconsider their relationship with their subject peoples. In 1867, the Ausgleich, or compromise, created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. This arrangement gave Hungary its parliament and autonomy while preserving the overall unity of the empire under the crown. Franz Joseph remained Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, but the internal cohesion of the empire continued to weaken under the weight of growing nationalist sentiment among other ethnic groups who were excluded from the power-sharing agreement. Despite these internal tensions, the late 19th century saw a period of industrial growth, cultural innovation, and relative stability within the empire. Cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Prague flourished as centers of art, science, and intellectual life. The Habsburg court became increasingly ceremonial, and Franz Joseph, with his conservative demeanor and strict personal discipline, became an icon of imperial continuity. Yet beneath the surface, the forces of nationalism and modern political ideology continued to gather strength. Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and Serbs all demanded recognition, autonomy, and in many cases independence. The final blow came in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. The Habsburg response, an ultimatum to Serbia backed by Germany, triggered the chain of alliances that led to World War I. Austria-Hungary entered the war as part of the Central Powers alongside Germany, fighting on multiple fronts against Russia, Italy, and later, the Allies. The war exposed the fragility of the empire's internal cohesion. Ethnic divisions, economic collapse, and battlefield losses undermined support for the monarchy. Nationalist leaders seized the opportunity to break away, and by the war's end, the Habsburg realm had unraveled completely. In November 1918, as defeat loomed and revolution swept through the empire, Emperor Karl I, who had succeeded Franz Joseph 2 years earlier, renounced participation in state affairs and went into exile. The empire dissolved into a series of successor states, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia among them, marking the end of Habsburg rule after more than 6 centuries. The legacy of the Habsburgs is deeply ambivalent. They held together a vast, multi-ethnic empire longer than almost any other dynasty in European history, providing a degree of continuity and order in an often fractured region. They patronized the arts, encouraged education, and built one of the most ornate and cosmopolitan imperial courts in the world. Yet their unwillingness to grant meaningful autonomy to their subject peoples, combined with their resistance to democratic reform, left them vulnerable to the forces of nationalism and modern political change. In the end, theirs was truly an empire without a single nation, an imperial structure that could not survive the pressures of the 20th century. The Romanovs, autocracy and upheaval in the East. The Romanov dynasty emerged in a time of profound crisis for Russia. Following the death of Tsar Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible in 1584, Russia descended into a period of instability and chaos, known as the Time of Troubles. This era, characterized by famine, foreign invasion, and civil war, left the Russian state fractured and leaderless. After a series of pretenders and weak rulers, the Russian nobility, the boyars, convened in 1613 and chose Mikhail Romanov, a 16-year-old boy related by marriage to Ivan IV, as the new Tsar. His selection marked the beginning of a dynasty that would rule Russia for over 300 years, shaping the destiny of the largest territorial empire in Europe and Asia. Mikhail Romanov's reign began the long process of restoring order to the Russian state. Under his leadership and that of his successors, the Romanovs gradually reasserted central control, re-established serfdom as the foundation of Russian society, and pushed back foreign occupiers. Over the 17th century, the dynasty consolidated power, expanded territorial control into Siberia and beyond, and centralized authority around the monarchy. Russia became a deeply hierarchical society with the Tsar at its apex, supported by a rigid bureaucracy, a powerful Orthodox church, and a largely enslaved peasantry bound to the land. The transformation of Russia into a modern imperial power began in earnest under Peter I, later known as Peter the Great. Ascending the throne in 1682, Peter was determined to drag Russia out of medieval isolation and into the modern European world. He traveled incognito to Western Europe to study shipbuilding, military tactics, and technology. Upon returning, he launched an ambitious program of westernization. He reformed the army and navy, built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea as a window to the West, and imposed sweeping cultural changes, from European-style dress to the shaving of noblemen's beards. His reforms were enforced through autocratic means, often brutally, but they succeeded in making Russia a major player on the European stage. Peter's military victories, particularly in the Great Northern War against Sweden, secured access to the Baltic Sea and established Russia as a dominant power in Eastern Europe. His reign also marked the formal declaration of the Russian Empire in 1721. After his death, however, the empire entered a period of instability. Successive rulers, including several empresses who rose to power through palace intrigue and coups, continued to expand Russian territory and influence, but the autocracy often became entangled in court conspiracies and corruption. The next truly transformative ruler came in the 18th century with Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great. A German princess who seized power from her husband, Peter III, Catherine reigned from 1762 to 1796 and continued Peter the Great's policies of modernization. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, patronized the arts and education, and expanded the empire's borders through wars with the Ottoman Empire and the partitioning of Poland. Yet while she embraced the rhetoric of Enlightenment absolutism, she ruled with a firm hand and crushed popular revolts, most notably the Pugachev Rebellion in 1773. Under her reign, Russia absorbed millions of new subjects, including large populations of Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Muslims, making the empire even more diverse and more difficult to govern. As the 19th century progressed, Russia remained a vast, multi-ethnic autocracy, with the Tsar wielding absolute authority. Yet it also became increasingly clear that the empire was falling behind Western Europe in industrial development, governance, and civil liberties. The Napoleonic Wars initially bolstered Russian prestige. Tsar Alexander I played a central role in the defeat of Napoleon, but post-war Russia remained conservative and repressive. The Decembrist Revolt of 1825, led by liberal army officers who sought constitutional reform, was crushed by Alexander's successor, Nicholas I, whose rule was defined by political reaction, censorship, and secret police. The turning point came with the Crimean War in the 1850s, in which Russia suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a Western alliance. The loss exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military, economy, and bureaucracy. Tsar Alexander II responded with a series of reforms, most famously the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Though intended as a modernization measure, the reform fell short of its promises. Former serfs remained impoverished and tied to their land through debt and restrictions, while nobles resented the erosion of their privileges. Alexander also reformed the legal system, introduced local councils, zemstvos, and expanded education. Yet his reforms provoked both conservative backlash and radical opposition. In 1881, he was assassinated by a revolutionary group, and his successor, Alexander III, rolled back many of the liberalizing efforts, ruling with an iron grip and promoting Russian nationalism and orthodoxy as unifying forces. By the time Nicholas II came to power in 1894, Russia was a deeply divided empire on the brink of crisis. The pressures of modernization clashed with the rigid structure of autocracy. Industrial growth led to the rise of a working class increasingly influenced by socialist ideas, while peasant unrest and nationalist movements continued to simmer in the countryside and outer provinces. Nicholas, a devout believer in divine monarchy, proved ill-suited to the challenges of the modern era. His reign was marked by a series of disasters, both domestic and foreign. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 ended in defeat, sparking protests and uprisings across the empire. The 1905 revolution forced Nicholas to grant limited reforms, including the creation of a legislative body, the Duma, but real power remained concentrated in the monarchy. Despite a brief period of economic growth and political opening in the years before World War I, the empire remained unstable. When war broke out in 1914, Russia once again mobilized on a massive scale, but its military was poorly equipped and its leadership incompetent. Millions of Russians were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The war placed an unbearable strain on the already fragile state. Food shortages, inflation, and battlefield losses led to strikes, mutinies, and mass discontent. In early 1917, protests in Petrograd spiraled into a full-blown revolution. Nicholas II, isolated and lacking support, abdicated in March, bringing an end to more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The fall of the Romanovs did not bring peace. A provisional government took power, but it was soon challenged by the Bolsheviks, who seized control in the October Revolution and plunged Russia into civil war. In 1918, Nicholas II and his family were executed by Bolshevik forces in a grim and symbolic end to the dynasty. The new Soviet regime sought to erase the memory of the tsars, but the legacy of Romanov rule remained deeply embedded in Russia's political culture, national identity, and imperial structure. The Romanov dynasty had built one of the most powerful and territorially vast empires in the world, but it had failed to adapt to the forces of industrialization, nationalism, and political reform. Its reliance on autocracy, repression, and rigid hierarchy ultimately made it brittle and unable to withstand the shocks of modern war and revolution. Though it fostered great cultural achievements and commanded a formidable state apparatus, the Romanovs presided over a system that collapsed under its contradictions in the early 20th century. How these monarchies shaped European conflict. The monarchies of Europe were never isolated entities. They existed in constant relationship, sometimes cooperative, often adversarial, with one another. The dynastic networks that linked rulers across borders could be both sources of peace and triggers of devastating war. The great ruling houses of Eastern and Northern Europe, the Romanovs of Russia, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia and later Germany, the Habsburgs of Austria, and others, played a central role in shaping the diplomacy and conflicts that defined the continent from the early modern period through the First World War. Their ambitions, marriages, rivalries, and insecurities fueled a series of diplomatic entanglements and military clashes that reshaped European borders, institutions, and national identities. During the 17th and 18th centuries, dynastic politics operated within a framework in which personal unions and royal marriages were key tools of diplomacy. The Habsburgs perfected the strategy of securing power through marital alliances, extending their reach into Spain, the Netherlands, and various Italian principalities. These unions were not simply personal or romantic choices. They were strategic instruments intended to strengthen claims to territories, forge alliances, and preempt war. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, formalized the principles of state sovereignty, but the reality of dynastic politics often blurred these boundaries. Even after Westphalia, the rulers of Europe frequently regarded their states as personal holdings, to be expanded, divided, or inherited like property. These dynastic interests frequently brought monarchs into conflict. One of the clearest examples was the War of the Austrian Succession, triggered by the contested accession of Maria Theresa to the Habsburg throne. Although she was recognized by some European powers, others, including Prussia under Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great, saw an opportunity to expand their influence and territory. The war brought in nearly every major European power and was as much about maintaining the balance of power as it was about defending or challenging dynastic rights. It was followed by the 7 Years' War, in which Prussia, allied with Britain, clashed with Austria, France, and Russia. These wars, though often described in terms of state interests, were deeply rooted in the personal ambitions and rivalries of monarchs who considered themselves heirs to ancient claims and traditions. In the 19th century, dynastic rivalries continued to drive conflict, though the rise of nationalism began to alter the framework within which monarchs operated. The Napoleonic Wars, which resulted in the redrawing of much of Europe's political map, led to the Congress of Vienna in 1815. There, dynastic legitimacy was a guiding principle. Monarchs who had been deposed during the French Revolution and Napoleonic conquests were restored, and the great powers agreed to uphold a balance of power that would prevent any one nation or dynasty from dominating the continent again. The Habsburgs, under Prince Metternich's leadership, became champions of conservatism and dynastic legitimacy, opposing liberal and nationalist movements wherever they arose. Russia's Romanovs, too, joined the Holy Alliance to defend monarchical rule and suppress revolt. However, the seeds of future conflict were already germinating. In Prussia, the Hohenzollerns embraced a new form of power politics that fused dynastic ambition with nationalist fervor. Otto von Bismarck, the though not a monarch himself, served the Prussian crown by orchestrating a series of wars that united the German states under Hohenzollern leadership. The wars against Denmark, Austria, and France culminated in the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with King Wilhelm I of Prussia becoming the German emperor. This act symbolized not only the triumph of Prussian power over its rivals, but also the transformation of dynastic rule into the foundation of a national empire. The Habsburgs, now ruling a dual monarchy with Hungary, were forced to adapt to their diminished role in the German-speaking world, while the Romanovs looked on warily as the balance of power shifted westward. The newly unified Germany became a dominant force in European affairs, but its existence also heightened tensions. The alliance systems that formed in the late 19th century, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain, were partly responses to the ambitions and insecurities of monarchies. Royal families, though often related by blood, were also bound by historical grievances and competing national interests. The personal relationships between rulers could influence diplomacy in both constructive and destructive ways. For example, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were cousins, as was King George V of Britain. Their correspondence in the days leading up to World War I, often signed with affectionate nicknames like Nicky and Willie, reveals the tensions between familial bonds and political obligations. As the 20th century approached, these dynastic ties were increasingly unable to contain the forces of militarism, nationalism, and imperial competition. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, heir to the Habsburg throne, set in motion the catastrophic chain reaction that became the First World War. Austria-Hungary's response to Serbia, backed by Germany and opposed by Russia, transformed a local crisis into a continental conflict. Although it was fueled by broader political, economic, and social dynamics, World War I was, in part, a dynastic war. It involved empires ruled by monarchs who still wielded significant power and who had deep personal stakes in the outcome. The war ultimately marked the end of dynastic Europe. By its conclusion, the Hohenzollerns had been dethroned in Germany, the Habsburg Empire had dissolved, and the Romanovs had been executed. The monarchies that had once shaped diplomacy, claimed divine right, and stood as symbols of continuity and tradition collapsed under the weight of modern warfare, revolution, and social change. Their failure to adapt to the new realities of popular politics, mass mobilization, and national self-determination spelled their doom. What began as a system of personal rule and familial alliances ended in bloodshed and exile. Nevertheless, the legacy of dynastic diplomacy and conflict continues to shape how we understand European history. The actions of these monarchs were not isolated from the currents of their time. They both influenced and were influenced by the evolving nature of statehood, identity, and power. Their marriages created empires, their rivalries destroyed them. In war and peace, in coronations and catastrophe, the tsars, kaisers, and kings of Europe left behind a continent that still bears the marks of their ambitions. The First World War was a cataclysmic event that marked the end of the old order in Europe. As the conflict ground on from 1914 to 1918, the monarchies that had dominated the continent for centuries found themselves unable to survive the demands of total war, economic devastation, and social upheaval. By the war's end, the ancient dynasties of the Romanovs, Habsburgs, and Hohenzollerns had fallen, their empires shattered, and their rulers either exiled, executed, or forgotten. The war, more than any other force, stripped away the legitimacy of hereditary rule in much of Europe and paved the way for new ideologies, republics, and revolutionary movements. The Russian Empire was the first to fall. By early 1917, the strains of war had pushed the Tsarist regime to the brink. Millions of Russians had died in battle, and the economy was in collapse. Food shortages and inflation brought workers and peasants into the streets in mass protests. The army, once loyal, began to mutiny. Nicholas II, who had taken personal command of the military despite lacking strategic skill, lost the confidence of both his generals and the political elite. In March 1917, he was forced to abdicate. The monarchy was abolished, and a provisional government was installed, though it struggled to maintain order. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution, establishing a radically new regime that rejected monarchy, aristocracy, and capitalism alike. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest, and in July 1918, Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik forces in Ekaterinburg. The execution was not only a political act, but a symbolic severing of ties with the past. The imperial family was no longer seen as sacred or untouchable, but as relics of an unjust order swept away by revolution. The Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany, while initially better positioned than the Romanovs, faced a similar fate by the war's end. Germany entered the war in 1914 with nationalistic zeal and a strong sense of imperial purpose. But after 4 years of grinding conflict, mounting casualties, and a naval blockade that led to starvation and civil unrest, the situation became untenable. In November 1918, with revolution spreading across German cities and soldiers' councils forming in open rebellion, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The monarchy was dissolved, and a republic, the Weimar Republic, was declared in Berlin. Wilhelm lived in exile until he died in 1941, but the imperial crown he once wore had become a symbol of militarism, arrogance, and failure in the eyes of many Germans. The once proud German Empire was now a republic struggling to redefine its identity in the aftermath of total. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled for centuries by the Habsburg dynasty, was perhaps the most complex and multifaceted of the imperial dissolutions. Comprising dozens of nationalities, languages, and religious groups, the dual monarchy had long depended on a delicate balance of power between Austria and Hungary, enforced by imperial prestige and bureaucratic centralization. World War I upset that balance. As battlefield losses mounted and ethnic tensions intensified, the empire began to unravel from within. Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Poles all pushed for autonomy or outright independence. In October 1918, national councils began declaring sovereignty across the empire. Emperor Karl I, who had succeeded the long-reigning Franz Joseph in 1916, attempted to reform the monarchy into a federal state but was too late. On November 11, 1918, Karl relinquished his participation in state affairs, effectively ending Habsburg rule. He refused to formally abdicate, clinging to the hope of restoration, but he was forced into exile and died in obscurity. The empire was carved into several successor states, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, forever ending the Habsburg presence as a unifying imperial force in Central Europe. The fall of these dynasties was more than the loss of individual rulers. It represented the collapse of an entire system of governance and legitimacy that had defined European politics for centuries. Monarchs had ruled not merely by force but by invoking divine right, tradition, and national unity. With the end of World War I, those claims rang hollow. The suffering and destruction caused by the war discredited the old elites. For the first time in modern European history, republics became the dominant form of government across much of the continent. Some monarchies, such as those in Britain, Italy, and the Scandinavian countries, survived the war, but they increasingly served as constitutional symbols rather than governing powers. The post-war settlement, embodied in the Treaty of Versailles and related agreements, attempted to establish a new order based on national self-determination, liberal democracy, and collective security. Empires were dismantled, and new nations were created, often with borders drawn by the victorious Allied powers rather than by local populations. In practice, the treaties left many unresolved grievances. Germans saw the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliating diktat, while Hungarians lamented the loss of 2/3 of their territory under the Treaty of Trianon. Russians, under Bolshevik rule, were excluded from the negotiations altogether. The hopes for a peaceful and democratic Europe were quickly tested by economic instability, extremist ideologies, and the lingering resentments born of imperial collapse. Despite the dramatic shift away from dynastic rule, the cultural and historical legacy of these monarchies persisted. In some regions, royalist movements continued to agitate for restoration. In others, former aristocrats retained social influence, even if stripped of political power. In the decades that followed, the fall of the tsars, kaisers, and emperors would be viewed by some as liberation, by others as a tragic loss of order and tradition. The 20th century would be shaped by this tension between the old world of inherited rule and the new world of mass politics and ideologies. In just a few years, monarchies that had stood for centuries were swept away by war, revolution, and nationalist demands. The fall of the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, and Habsburgs marked the end of an era defined by dynastic prestige imperial expansion, and absolute power. What followed was a Europe in search of new principles, new institutions, and new ways to govern itself. The modern age had begun, and it carried with it both the promise of democracy and the peril of instability. Although the monarchies of the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, and Habsburgs collapsed in the early 20th century, their legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the cultural memory and historical identity of Europe. The images of grand palaces, elaborate coronations, military pageantry, and the dramatic personalities of emperors and empresses have become embedded in both national narratives and popular imagination. Even in republics born out of revolution and war, the fascination with royal figures and dynastic legacies remains strong. These ruling houses, once wielding near absolute power, now live on in museum exhibits, films, literature, historical debates, and public memory, serving as symbols of both glory and downfall, continuity and disruption. In Russia, the Romanovs have undergone a complex posthumous transformation. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a resurgence of interest in the imperial family. Once vilified as tyrants and enemies of the people by the Bolsheviks, the Romanovs, especially Nicholas II and his family, were gradually recast as tragic victims of revolution. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the last Tsar and his immediate family as passion bearers, a type of saint in Eastern Christianity who endures suffering with humility. Their remains, exhumed and identified in the late 1900s, were buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg alongside earlier tsars, completing a symbolic act of national reconciliation. For some Russians, especially those who view the Soviet period with ambivalence or regret, the Romanovs represent a lost era of order, grandeur, and spiritual unity, even as others continue to critique their autocracy and failure to reform. The legacy of the Hohenzollerns in Germany is similarly nuanced. After World War I and the establishment of the Weimar Republic, the monarchy was officially abolished, and royal estates were seized or contested. Wilhelm II spent his final decades in exile in the Netherlands, isolated from the dramatic events unfolding in his homeland. Yet over time, public interest in the imperial period has grown, particularly about Prussian culture, architecture, and governance. The Prussian emphasis on discipline, bureaucracy, and education is often seen as a foundation for modern German statehood. At the same time, there is an ongoing debate among historians and the public about the extent to which the Hohenzollern dynasty contributed to the militarism and nationalism that fueled the rise of Nazism. In recent years, descendants of the family have sought the return of confiscated properties, sparking legal and ethical discussions about historical responsibility, restitution, and the role of the monarchy in shaping 20th-century catastrophe. In Austria and Hungary, the Habsburg dynasty is remembered with a mixture of nostalgia, ambivalence, and regional pride. While the empire was often seen as repressive and overly bureaucratic during its final decades, it also represented a multinational polity that offered a degree of stability in a diverse and often volatile region. The long reign of Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled from 1848 to 1916, is particularly remembered as a period of both conservatism and cultural flourishing. Cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Prague still display the architectural and artistic grandeur of the imperial era. Figures such as Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, have become romantic icons in popular culture, depicted in films, novels, and tourist memorabilia. In Central Europe, the memory of the Habsburgs continues to stir debates about identity, federalism, and the possibilities of coexistence among different ethnic and linguistic communities. Popular culture across Europe and beyond has also played a significant role in preserving and transforming the legacy of these dynasties. From historical dramas to documentaries, the personal stories of tsars, kaisers, and emperors are retold with a blend of accuracy and artistic license. The tragic fate of the Romanovs, in particular, has inspired countless books, films, and conspiracy theories, including the long-running myth that Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Nicholas II, survived the execution, a claim definitively disproven by DNA evidence but still influential in storytelling. Television series and cinematic depictions of royal courts often focus on the intrigue, romance, and decadence of dynastic life, framing monarchs as both powerful rulers and deeply flawed human beings. This portrayal fuels ongoing fascination and allows modern audiences to engage with history in emotionally resonant ways. In education and scholarship, the study of dynastic rule continues to evolve. Historians increasingly examine monarchies not just as political institutions, but as cultural systems that help define concepts of legitimacy, identity, and sovereignty. The personal decisions of monarchs, whom to marry, how to raise their children, how to present themselves to their subjects, were deeply political acts that shaped the character of empires. Modern historiography often integrates perspectives from social, gender, and cultural history, exploring how monarchy intersected with broader trends in religion, nationalism, and modernity. The emphasis is not merely on wars and treaties, but on symbols, rituals, and the construction of public image. Tourism and public commemoration also reflect the enduring appeal of dynastic heritage. Royal palaces such as the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Sanssouci in Potsdam, and Schönbrunn in Vienna draw millions of visitors annually. These sites, preserved as museums or historical monuments, offer immersive experiences of imperial life and serve as physical reminders of a past that, though gone, remains central to many national narratives. Statues, portraits, royal regalia, and archives are carefully maintained, not only for historical study but as part of broader cultural memory. In some cases, national governments fund these efforts as part of heritage tourism or civic education, highlighting the ambiguous yet important role of monarchy in their country's histories. Though absolute monarchy has disappeared in most of Europe, constitutional monarchies still exist, and in places like the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands, royal families maintain ceremonial roles. While the Romanovs, Habsburgs, and Hohenzollerns no longer sit on thrones, their descendants continue to appear in public discourse, sometimes advocating for historical restoration, engaging in philanthropy, or participating in ceremonial events. These figures are not politically powerful, but their lineage still attracts attention. In the digital age, social media and online communities have further revived interest in royal genealogy, imperial history, and the private lives of monarchs. Whether viewed with reverence, skepticism, or curiosity, the dynasties of old remain part of Europe's cultural landscape. The legacy of tsars, kaisers, and kings is ultimately a legacy of contradiction. They represent both the pinnacle of traditional authority and its downfall. They are symbols of both national pride and imperial oppression. Their grandeur and failures continue to fascinate, provoke, and educate. The modern world, shaped by democracy, technology, and global interconnection, still looks back to these dynasties for insight into how power once operated and how it might evolve again. Their stories serve as cautionary tales and sources of inspiration, enduring far beyond the fall of their crowns. The histories of the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, Habsburgs, and other dynastic houses are more than stories of crowns and courts. They are reflections of how power was imagined, exercised, and contested in Eastern and Northern Europe over centuries. These monarchies did not merely rule. They shaped languages, institutions, borders, wars, religions, and the very conception of nationhood. The dynasties that once sat atop vast empires governed with immense authority, believing their power derived from divine will, bloodline, and historic destiny. Yet the arc of modern history reveals that such rule was never absolute or eternal. It was always negotiated through diplomacy, war, marriage, reform, resistance, and revolution. In the early modern period, these monarchies rose alongside the formation of the state itself. Dynastic families such as the Romanovs and Hohenzollerns provided the framework for imperial administration and military conquest. They symbolized the unity of sprawling and often diverse populations, offering a single figure, be it czar, kaiser, or king, as the embodiment of the state. Their legitimacy came not only from power, but from tradition, faith, and spectacle. But as societies changed, through urbanization, industrialization, nationalism, and democratization, these monarchs found their authority questioned. The very tools they used to unify their realms, bureaucracy, education, military service, also produced citizens more aware of their rights, more critical of injustice, and more capable of organizing opposition. The First World War served as a violent fulcrum. It shattered empires, erased monarchies, and forced entire populations to reconsider the structures under which they lived. The Romanovs fell to revolution, the Hohenzollerns to defeat, the Habsburgs to disintegration. Their empires dissolved into republics and new nation-states, often fraught with ethnic tension and economic hardship. The treaties that followed sought to establish a new order based on national self-determination, but they were haunted by the unresolved legacies of dynastic rule. Borders drawn without regard for cultural and linguistic realities created grievances that would later erupt again. Meanwhile, the memory of empire lingered in architecture, law, folklore, nostalgia, and resistance. In Eastern and Northern Europe, the 20th century became a story of tension between old and new sovereignties. The region witnessed the rise of communism, fascism, and democracy, often within a single lifetime. The question of who holds power, and how that power is justified, became central to politics and identity. Former royal symbols were sometimes repurposed, sometimes erased. While Western Europe retained some ceremonial monarchies, Eastern and Central Europe largely moved away from hereditary rule, focusing instead on party structures, ideology, or liberal constitutions. And yet, even in republics, the longing for continuity, grandeur, or national unity often led people to reimagine or romanticize their imperial pasts. Today, in the 21st century, the legacy of tsars, kaisers, and kings is not merely a matter of history. It is a living part of cultural consciousness. The palaces of St. Petersburg and Potsdam, the portraits of monarchs in state museums, the public debates over restitution or commemoration, all point to the enduring relevance of dynastic rule in understanding modern sovereignty. These monarchies helped create the world we now inhabit, even if they no longer dominate it. They teach us that power, when concentrated and unchecked, can lead to both astonishing achievement and profound destruction. They also remind us that authority must evolve with the people it seeks to govern. The story of dynastic Europe is ultimately one of transformation. From absolute rule to constitutional monarchy to republicanism and beyond, Eastern and Northern Europe have been shaped by centuries of shifting sovereignties. The monarchies that once dominated the continent have given way to more pluralistic forms of power, yet the questions they embodied, about leadership, legitimacy, and the role of tradition, remain with us. In studying the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, Habsburgs, and others, we do not merely look back in time. We confront the ongoing human drama of authority, identity, and change. Their rise and fall mark not just the end of a political system, but the beginning of the modern era, and the continuing challenge of building states that honor both history and the hopes of their people.